The wind had a dry, papery sound that afternoon, slipping through the junipers above Cedar Mesa and rattling their blue-green branches like old bones in a jar. Dust lifted from the trail in soft brown sheets, then settled again over the boots of the crew, as if the canyon wanted to hide every print they made. Elias Rowan had one hand braced against a fallen trunk, and the other wrapped around a faded canvas jacket. And inside that jacket was a weight so light it frightened him. The Bobcat did not fight anymore. That was what made the men and women behind him go quiet. Only 20 minutes earlier, she had been all teeth, claws, breath, and warning. She had been wedged deep in a collapsed juniper hollow where the roots had torn loose from the slope after 3 days of hard wind. The tree had gone down crooked, its trunk split, its roots lifted like a claw from the earth. Beneath that tangle, in the shade where the sand stayed cold, the crew had heard a low rasp that was not the sound of wind, branch, or stone. Now Elias carried her against his chest, wrapped carefully, with his chin tucked down and his steps slow enough not to jolt her. Marta DeLeon, who usually had something cheerful to say, even when a trail washed out or a pack mule refused a crossing, held the first aid kit against her ribs and just stared. Wade Pierce stood with his shovel still in one hand. Young Tommy Vale, 22 and eager, had taken off his hard hat without realizing it. Even Ranger Naomi Bell, who had seen injured hawks, mule deer tangled in wire, and coyotes too tired to run, kept her radio lowered at her side. The Bobcat's head shifted. That was all. A small movement inside the jacket. Elias stopped because he felt it before he saw it. He felt the fragile tightening of muscle, the stubborn life gathering itself inside that bundle of dust-colored fur. Then a face emerged near the fold of his sleeve. She was not large, not like people imagined when they used the word wild with too much drama in their voices. She was compact and lean, built of silence and suddenness, with a tawny coat marked in dark rosettes, and a pale muzzle powdered with dirt. One of her whiskers on the right side had broken short. The edge of her left ear was nicked, not fresh, just an old small injury that made her look as if the desert itself had signed her. Her amber eyes were half narrowed against the light. She looked at Elias, not at the crew, not at the open slope or the brush beyond him, at him. Her ears flattened for one breath, then eased. Her mouth opened just enough for a thin sound to come out. Not a cry exactly, not a purr, not anything tame. It was more like a tired complaint, offered to the one body in the world that was not hurting her at that moment. And that was when the trail crew paused. Elias had spent 17 years fixing footpaths through country that did not like to be fixed. He knew how to read a washed-out switchback, how to judge whether a stone step would hold, how to smell rain before the clouds committed to it. He knew the weight of a Pulaski over one shoulder and the ache that settled in a man's knees after a day of digging drainage channels. What he did not know was why that small, wild face, lifted from his old jacket, made something inside his chest loosen after years of staying clenched. He was 56 years old, though the sun had added its own years to him. His beard had gone gray at the chin. His hands were rough enough to snack wool. He lived alone in a 2-room cabin outside Bluff, in a place where evenings arrived copper-colored and the stars came out before a man could pretend he was not lonely. On most mornings, he drank black coffee from a chipped enamel mug and listened to the silence where his daughter's voice used to be. He had not expected the day to ask anything tender of him. It had begun with work. A fallen juniper blocked the North Ridge Trail above the dry wash, and the crew had hiked in after sunrise with saws, ropes, shovels, and the usual small complaints. The air smelled of crushed sage and old bark. Ravens crossed overhead like scraps of black cloth. Somebody joked about the tree choosing the worst possible place to die. Tommy said the roots looked like a giant hand. Wade told him not to give the tourists ideas. Then the sound came from under the hollow. At first, they thought it was a trapped kit fox. Naomi made everyone step back. Elias crouched in the dust, pulled off one glove, and listened. There it was again, low, rough, alive. The crew shifted in a half circle, suddenly careful. Wild animals did not owe people gratitude. Fear could make even a small creature dangerous. Naomi called the wildlife rehabilitator in Monticello, then a local vet who sometimes met rescue crews along the back roads. They were told to keep distance, reduce noise, and only move the fallen root mass if they could do it without crushing whatever was inside. Elias had been the one thin enough to slide partway into the shade beneath the lifted roots. The smell under there was sharp, dry earth, old sap, dust, and the musky fear of a wild animal pressed too long into one place. He saw eyes first, two amber sparks low in the dark. Then the faint outline of a bob tail, one hind leg tucked awkwardly, one paw pinned beneath a root strand and a wedge of stone. The bobcat struck the air when his hand came too close. Fast, not weak in spirit, only in body. Easy, Elias had murmured, though he knew the word meant nothing to her. Maybe the tone did. Or maybe exhaustion made her choose stillness. They worked for nearly an hour. Naomi guided every movement. Wade levered the root a fraction higher. Marta slid a folded tarp beneath the trapped side. Tommy held his breath so long his cheeks colored red. Twice the bobcat hissed, and everyone froze. Once her paw brushed Elias's wrist. Not a strike, not trust, just contact, and he felt the tremor running through her. When at last the stone shifted free and her paw came loose, she did not leap. That frightened him more than the hissing had. She tried to rise, failed, and pressed herself into the hollow, as if the dark were the only thing she still believed in. Elias took off his canvas jacket, the brown one with the torn cuff and trail dust ground permanently into the seams. He waited until Naomi nodded. Then he wrapped the jacket around the bobcat in one slow, careful motion, keeping her head covered just enough to calm her without smothering the light. She weighed less than she should have. That was the thought that stayed with him as he carried her out. Not how sharp her claws were, not how wild she was, how little of her there seemed to be under all that fur and courage. Now, standing on the trail, with the crew gone silent around him, Elias looked down as the bobcat kept her eyes on his face. A bit of juniper needle clung to the white fur under her chin. Her broken whisker pointed forward at an odd angle, giving her a look of stern, exhausted judgment. For one strange second, he almost smiled. "You don't think much of our rescue work, do you?" he whispered. Marta made a soft sound, nearly a laugh, and nearly something else. The bobcat blinked once, slowly. Not friendly, not tame, but not empty of meaning either. Elias felt the crew waiting, all of them caught inside that single quiet exchange. The desert held its breath with them. Somewhere below, a raven called. Farther down the wash, loose sand moved in the wind with a sound like fabric being dragged over wood. Naomi stepped closer, gentle but firm. "Truck's ready." Elias nodded. He started walking again. The bobcat tucked her head back into the jacket, but not all the way. One amber eye remained visible through the fold, watching the trail, the boots, the sunlight, the hands that kept their distance. She was hurt and frightened, and she belonged to no one. Elias understood that corely. He did not mistake her stillness for affection. He did not mistake need for permission. Still, as he carried her toward the waiting truck, he felt the old hollow inside him answer the hollow she had come from. For anyone listening to this story in a quiet room somewhere, maybe with an animal's memory still living gently in the heart, there would be time later to like the story, to subscribe, and to share where they were watching from, along with the name of the animal that once changed their life. But on that ridge, All that mattered was the next careful step. The truck waited beneath a piñon pine, its tailgate lowered, a blue blanket spread over a crate. The blanket belonged to Marta, who insisted it was lucky because it had survived 2 flat tires, 1 flash flood, and her nephew's birthday party. Tommy had placed a shallow water pan nearby, though Naomi reminded him the Bobcat would likely ignore it out of principle. Wade stood beside the door with both hands open, as if surrendering to a creature that weighed less than his lunch cooler. Elias reached the truck and paused before lowering her. The Bobcat lifted her head again. This time, she looked past him toward the ridge, toward the torn juniper, toward the wild country that had trapped her and still belonged to her. Her nostrils moved. Her ears turned toward the wind. A thread of sunlight caught in her eyes. Then, very slowly, she pressed one paw against the inside of Elias's jacket. Not hard, not soft, just enough for him to feel it. The crew saw it. That was why they remembered the moment for years. Not because the rescue had been dramatic, not because anyone had shouted or cried, but because a wounded bobcat, carried from a fallen juniper hollow by a lonely trailman with dust in his beard, had paused at the edge of safety and placed one small wild paw against him, as if marking the moment before letting it pass. Elias lowered her into the crate. Naomi secured the latch. The bobcat turned once, favoring one side, then settled in the blue blanket without taking her eyes off the open world beyond the truck. No one spoke until the tailgate closed. Even then, the first words came quietly. "Well," Wade said, clearing his throat, "I guess we're taking the scenic way back." And for the first time all afternoon, Elias smiled. Before the bobcat in the juniper hollow, before the blue blanket in the trail truck, before the whole crew learned how silence could gather around one injured animal, Elias Rowan's life had been measured by simple things. A kettle beginning to tick on the stove before sunrise, the scrape of a chair leg across the cabin floor, the dry cough of his old pickup when the morning air held too much cold, the first spoonful of coffee stirred inside a chipped enamel mug with a blue rim and a hairline crack near the handle. He lived 8 miles outside Bluff, Utah, where the road thinned into gravel and then seemed to lose interest in being a road at all. His cabin sat beyond a cattle guard, tucked under a low rise of sandstone, with 2 piñon pines leaning beside it like old men sharing a secret. In spring, tiny desert flowers sometimes appeared near the step without warning, purple and yellow against the dust. In winter, frost silvered the sage and made even the fence wire look delicate. Most of the year, though, the land around Elias was the color of sun-baked bread, red stone, gray brush, pale brass, and sky so wide it made a man tell the truth to himself whether he wanted to or not. Elias did not mind living alone. At least, that was what he told people. He had been a trail crew supervisor for the county and Park Service partnerships for 17 years. Before that, he had worked ranch fences, guided a little, hauled stone, and once spent 6 months fixing roofs in Moab, until he decided roofs kept a man too far from the ground. He preferred paths. A trail made sense to him. They could be damaged by flood, buried by slide, cut wrong by careless feet, or widened by too much use, but it never pretended to be anything except a way through. He liked that. Every workday, he woke at 4:45 without needing an alarm. He fed the stove if the morning was cold. He drank coffee standing at the counter, one hand around the chipped mug, the other resting flat on the worn pine, as if steadying himself for the day. Then he checked the weather radio, packed a dented lunch tin, and drove toward whatever stretch of trail had lost its patience with gravity. His crew teased him for always carrying 3 pencils, never 2 and never 4. Martha said it was because he expected the mountain to borrow one. Wade said it was because Elias did not trust pens or people who used them. Tommy once asked why, And Elias only shrugged. "Two break," he said. "One gets you home." That was Elias, practical enough to sound dry, gentle enough that nobody took his dryness for meanness. He was not a loud man. He did not fill empty air just because it was empty. When the crew rested in the shade, he listened more than he spoke. He knew Marta's nephew had asthma and loved dinosaurs. He knew Wade's wife packed him sliced apples, even though Wade pretended not to like them. He knew Tommy was saving money for a truck that would almost certainly be a mistake. He remembered small things and gave advice in pieces so short people sometimes miss the care inside them. Drink before you're thirsty. Don't step where the sand is shiny. Let the tool do half the work. At home, no one heard those sentences. That was the part he noticed most in the evenings. His daughter, Claire, had once filled the cabin with noise. Not loud noise, good noise. The hollow thump of her school backpack landing by the door. The little hum she made when she sketched at the table. The way she opened the same cupboard 3 times while deciding she did not want anything from it. Her mother, Laurel, had called it squirrel energy, and Claire had grinned every time, showing the small gap between her front teeth she refused to have fixed. Laurel had been gone 9 years. Cancer had taken her slowly enough for the house to learn the shape of absence before the final morning came. Elias did not talk about it much, not because he had stopped loving her, because some griefs did not become stories just because time passed. Claire had stayed through college in Flagstaff, then moved to Oregon for field biology work near the coast. She called every Sunday evening when she could. Her voice was bright, wind-blown, full of rain and tide pools and research permits. Elias loved hearing it. He also felt the ache after the call ended, when the cabin seemed to settle around him like a coat left too long on a hook. He had learned not to ask when she was coming home. He had also learned not to expect wild things to stay. That was why the country suited him. The mule deer came to the wash and vanished. Ravens rode the warm air and disappeared beyond the ridge. Coyotes sang somewhere in the dark, never close enough to belong to his porch light. Even the desert flowers stayed only a few days before the sun folded them back into dust. The land was beautiful because it did not promise permanence. Still, Elias kept habits that made the cabin feel less empty. He left the porch light on until he went to bed, though nobody was coming up the road. He placed his boots toe out beside the door, the way Laurel used to insist, because she said a man ought to be ready for mercy as much as trouble. He hung his work jacket on the same peg each night, even when it was stiff with dust. On the table by the window, he kept Claire's old green pencil sharpener shaped like a turtle. She had forgotten it there at 17. He had never moved it. There was also a crooked step on the porch that needed fixing. Elias meant to repair it every month for 3 years. The left board dipped slightly when stepped on, making a soft knock against the support beneath. It was not dangerous, just irritating. Every time it sounded under his boot, he thought of Laurel saying, "That step is talking to you again." Then he would answer, though no one was there. Let it talk. He never told the crew that part. The morning before the Juniper Hollow rescue, Elias had stood on that talking step with his coffee and watched a line of wind move across the sage. The whole valley seemed restless. Juniper branches shivered on the slope above the wash. Dust lifted in little devils and fell apart. The sky looked polished and hard. He had felt uneasy, though he could not have said why. Maybe the weather had been warning him. Maybe loneliness had its own barometer. At the trailhead, the crew gathered in their usual half-awake way. Marta arrived with her lucky blue blanket rolled under one arm because she had spilled soup on the truck seat the week before and claimed the blanket was now official county equipment. Wade brought a thermos big enough to water a horse. Tommy had new gloves and kept flexing his fingers, proud of them until Wade told him they looked too clean to trust. Elias checked the saw fuel, counted the wedges, looked over the rope, and handed Tommy one of his 3 pencils. For the work log, he said. Tommy blinked. You're giving me one? Don't make a ceremony of it. Marta hid a smile behind her coffee. That was how warmth usually arrived around Elias, sideways and quiet, never announced. He would bring extra jerky and claim it was because he bought the wrong kind. He would tighten a loose buckle on someone's pack while pretending it annoyed him. He would save the best patch of shade for Marta on long climbs, then act surprised when she noticed. He cared in repairs. That morning, as they hiked toward the North Ridge Trail, the land smelled of sage bruised by wind and dry juniper bark rubbed raw. Their boots slid over red dust. The sun had not yet turned harsh, but it had already begun sharpening the edges of stone. Ravens dipped low, then rose again. Somewhere far below, a truck passed on the highway, its sound thin and brief, swallowed quickly by the open country. Elias walked at the rear for part of the climb, watching the crew move ahead of him. Marta was telling Tommy a story with both hands. Wade was pretending not to listen. Naomi Bell, who had met them at the lower gate, moved with the steady patience of someone who trusted the desert only when she was paying attention to it. Elias respected Naomi. She did not sentimentalize wild animals, and she did not treat them like problems either. She understood that the land had its own business. That was why, later, when she told everyone to step back from the fallen hollow, they did. But in the hour before that discovery, the day was still only a workday. A blocked trail, a wind-thrown tree, another repair in a life built from repairs. Elias had no way of knowing that under the roots of that fallen juniper, a frightened bobcat was waiting in the cold shade, with a broken whisker, a nicked ear, and enough stubborn life left to make a whole crew hold its breath. He only knew the trail needed clearing, so he adjusted the strap of his pack, felt the familiar weight settle into his shoulders, and kept walking toward the ridge. The first sign was not the sound, it was the stillness. Elias had been kneeling beside the fallen juniper, studying the way the trunk had twisted across the trail, when the canyon seemed to close its mouth. The wind still moved through the needles above them. Tommy's shovel still scraped once against stone, but beneath the lifted root ball, in the cool pocket of shadow where the earth had torn open, there was a silence too deliberate to belong to wood. Elias raised one hand. The crew quieted by instinct. For several seconds, there was only the dry hiss of sand sliding over grass. The juniper had dragged its roots from the slope and left a hollow beneath, half cave and half wound. Crushed needles filled the air with a sharp, clean scent that reminded Elias of broken fences. Then the hollow breathed, just a rough, hidden exhale. Tommy's eyes widened. Marta lowered the coil of rope from her shoulder. Ranger Naomi Bell stepped closer, then stopped short of the shadow. Everybody back 2 steps, she said. No one argued. Elias stayed crouched, but he shifted his knees away from the opening and set both hands on his thighs, where whatever lived under there could see them. He had worked long enough in wild country to know that panic traveled easily from human bodies to animal ones. People often thought rescue meant doing something fast. Naomi knew better. Elias knew better too. Another breath came from the hollow. This one ended in a rasp. Elias leaned just enough to see past a veil of roots. At first, the dark gave him nothing. Then 2 eyes appeared from it, amber and hard, set low above a pale muzzle dusted with grit. A bobcat. The thought moved through the crew without anyone saying it. She was pressed sideways into the hollow. One shoulder wedged near a root, one hind leg tucked beneath her at an angle that made Elias's stomach tighten. Her coat blended with the earth and shredded bark so perfectly that she seemed shaped from dust, shadow, and warning. Dark spots ran along her forelegs. Her short tail was pulled close. The tip of one ear showed a small old nick. When Elias's boots shifted in the dirt, she opened her mouth and hissed. It was not loud, but it carried. Tommy stepped back, tripped on a stone, and caught himself against Wade's sleeve. Wade did not tease him. "She's pinned," Elias said quietly. Naomi moved beside him, slow as poured honey. "Can you see where?" "Backside, stone or root, hard to tell." The bobcat struck the air then, a quick blur of paw from the shadow. She did not reach them. She was warning, not wasting strength. The movement made the roots tremble, and dirt fell across her shoulders. She flinched and sank lower. Something inside Elias tightened. It was not pity exactly. Pity was too easy. This felt sharper, closer to recognition. He knew what it was to press oneself into the only darkness available, because the open world had become too bright and too full of hands. The bobcat did not know grief in human words, but fear made a hollow of its own. Naomi spoke into her radio, asking for wildlife support and telling dispatch they had a trapped bobcat, adult, conscious, stressed, possible leg injury. Marta opened the first aid kit, though there was nothing in it for a creature like this yet. Tommy took off his new gloves, put them back on, and looked embarrassed when Elias noticed. "Keep those on," Elias murmured. Tommy nodded hard. While they waited for guidance, Elias studied the tree. The fallen juniper had folded itself over a narrow animal passage beneath the bank. The bobcat must have used it before as a shaded resting place or a hidden route between the ridge and the wash. The windstorm had dropped the tree across her world without asking. The crew began working around the hollow with the care of people handling something breakable. Wade set a pry bar beneath a root as thick as his wrist. Marta laid her blue blanket over a jagged rock edge so no one would scrape too much noise from it. Tommy fetched wedges from the pack, then returned holding them like eggs. Elias slid off his canvas jacket and placed it in the dust beside him. The bobcat watched everything. Her eyes followed hands, not faces. When Naomi shifted her radio, the bobcat's ears flicked. When Marta's bracelet clicked against the first aid kit, the animal's whiskers twitched forward. One whisker on the right side was broken short, giving her muzzle an uneven look, as if she had argued with Thornbrush and refused to apologize. "She's judging us," Marta whispered. "She has reason," Elias said. A little warmth passed through the crew then, small but needed. Tommy gave the faintest smile. Wade let out a breath that might have become a laugh on an easier day. The rehabilitator called back with instructions. Lift only an inch. No sudden movement. If the animal panicked, stop. Wade leaned into the prow bar. Elias kept his body low and still. Marta watched for shifting stones. Tommy stood ready with a wedge, his clean gloves streaked red with dust. The root lifted. The bobcat hissed again, sharper now. Her paw flashed. Dirt slipped. Everyone froze. "Down," Naomi said. Wade eased the weight back. The bobcat's breathing came faster from the hollow. Elias could see the pale fur at her throat moving. She was afraid of them, and she was right to be. No careful voice could erase that. No good intention could explain itself to anther eyes under a fallen tree. Elias lowered himself fully onto the dirt. Not closer, lower. He took one of his 3 pencils from his pocket and set it aside so it would not jab him. The absurdity nearly made him smile. Laurel would have said he was making himself presentable for a bobcat. For a minute, he did nothing. The crew waited. The bobcat watched. Dust settled on Elias's sleeve. The hollow smelled of sap, fear, and cold earth. Then Elias spoke, not to comfort her with words she could not understand, but to soften the shape of the air between them. "Rough place to spend a morning," he said. The bobcat did not calm. She did not trust him. But she stopped striking at the space. That was enough for the next breath, and sometimes The next breath was all a rescue had to stand on. Trust did not arrive while the root was being lifted. It did not arrive when the stone loosened, or when the bobcat's pinned paw slipped free, or when everyone around the hollow let out the breath they had been holding. Those things were only rescue. Trust was slower, smaller, and Elias understood that the wild creature under the juniper owed them none of it. The first hour after freeing her was a careful kind of waiting. Dr. Samira Klein arrived in a dust-colored county truck with a field crate, thick gloves, and hair pinned beneath a faded ball cap. She did not rush toward the hollow. She stood beside Naomi first and watched. "That her?" she asked softly. The bobcat had not moved far. Once her paw was free, she had dragged herself deeper into the shadow, then stopped, too exhausted to spend more fear. Her amber eyes stayed open. Her ears turned at every sound. When the Vex truck door clicked shut, her broken right whisker twitched as if it had taken offense. "She's still choosing the hollow," Dr. Klein said. "Can't blame her," Elias answered. "No," the vet said. "We just have to make the next choice easier than staying there." They made the world around the bobcat smaller and quieter. Wade and Tommy carried the saws down trail. Marta gathered branches, moving so slowly that her bracelet stayed silent. Naomi radioed the lower junction and closed the trail. Elias remained near the hollow, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to vanish. 3 feet. That was the distance Dr. Klein chose. 3 feet from the opening, Elias sat in the red dust with his canvas jacket folded beside him and his hands resting open on his knees. "You don't need to talk much," Dr. Klein said. "I'm practiced at that." Marta coughed into one fist to hide a smile. The sun rose higher. Heat came off the stones in faint waves. Crushed juniper needles stuck to Elias's pants. A fly landed on his cheek, but he did not swat it. The bobcat watched the fly too. For one brief moment, man and animal seemed equally offended. Elias did not look directly into her eyes for long. He let his gaze settle nearby, on the torn roots, on the half-moon mark one claw had left in the dirt, on the pale dust along her muzzle. Naomi had taught the crew that care often began with not making yourself the center of another creature's terror. The bobcat's breathing slowed by degrees, not peacefully, only less sharply. Dr. Klein prepared a light sedative in case they had to use it, but she waited. Naomi crouched near the crate. Marta spread her blue blanket over its bottom, smoothing it twice. Tommy returned with a pan of water and set it down too loudly. The sound made the bobcat bare her teeth. Tommy froze. "Sorry," he whispered. Wade patted his shoulder. Pan survived. The warmth of it eased the crew. Just a little, not enough to make them careless. Elias felt the old ache in his knees, but he stayed where he was. Dust settled into the lines of his hands. He thought of Claire at 7 years old, crouched behind the cabin after finding a stunned sparrow beneath the window. She had wanted to scoop it up immediately. Laurel had knelt beside her and said, "Helping is mostly waiting, sweetheart." Elias had not forgotten Claire's small face trying to understand that love could sit still. Now he sat still for a bobcat. The bobcat shifted. Every person on the ridge noticed and pretended not to. She pulled her freed paw closer beneath her chest, then paused. Her nicked left ear tilted toward Elias. Her nose worked at the air. He smelled sweat, dust, machine oil, gum, and torn juniper. She smelled all of that and more, the complicated truth of them. Elias picked up his jacket by one sleeve and slid it forward an inch. The bobcat hissed. He stopped. A minute passed, then another. He slid it half an inch more. She did not hiss the second time, but her paw lifted from the dirt in warning. Small, quick, still full of pride. "Fair," Elias murmured. They worked in pieces after that. A jacket moved, a hand withdrew, a crate shifted. Silence returned. The Bobcat never surrendered. She only ran out of reasons to fight each careful motion. When Elias finally opened the jacket wide on the ground between them, she stared at it as if it were a trap with poor manners. Marta whispered, "She hates your coat." "She has taste," Wade said. "It's a good coat," Elias said. "It was a good coat," Marta corrected. Even Naomi smiled with her eyes. The Bobcat made a low rasp then, rough and offended, and Elias almost believed she had joined the argument. But she was only breathing through fear, through pain, through the instinct that told her survival meant trusting nothing upright. At last, Dr. Klein moved. She was swift, but not sudden. Naomi supported the crate. Elias brought the jacket forward, not grabbing, just closing the world gently around the Bobcat before terror could scatter her strength. The Bobcat struck once at the canvas. Her claws caught the torn cuff. Elias felt the pull and held steady. "Easy," Naomi said, though she was saying it to all of them. The Bobcat's body trembled under the jacket. Elias gathered her carefully, feeling the sharpness of bone beneath fur, the heat of her breath through cloth, the fierce little engine of her heart. She was not tame in his arms. She was not graceful. She was a wild animal caught between fear and exhaustion. And yet when he lifted her from the hollow, she did not twist toward his face. That was not trust, but it was the first small mercy. The crew made a path for him. Tommy moved a branch with both hands, as reverently as if he were opening a church door. Marta picked a burr from Elias's sleeve while walking beside him, and then pretended she had not done it. Wade carried the empty water pan because it had already caused enough trouble. Step by step, Elias carried the Bobcat out of the broken roots and into the sun. 3 feet had become 2 arms. That did not mean she belonged there. It only meant, for the length of that ridge trail and the slow walk to the truck, she had chosen not to spend her last strength, proving that she did not. By the time they reached the small wildlife clinic outside Monticello, the sun had gone white over the mesas, and the truck smelled of dust, warm vinyl, and juniper needles caught in everyone's clothes. The Bobcat rode in the field crate behind the cab, tucked into Marta's blue blanket, with her head lifted just enough to watch every movement through the wire door. She had not touched the water pan. She had not settled into anything that could be called rest. Whenever the truck slowed, her ears shifted. Whenever gravel popped under the tires, her lips tightened back from her teeth in a silent warning. Elias sat in the passenger seat with his torn jacket folded across his lap. He had not put it back on. There was Bobcat fur on the sleeve, a smear of red dust across the front, and 4 clean claw marks more the cuff where she had caught hold during the lift from the hollow. Marta had offered to shake it out for him at the trailhead, but Elias had only laid one hand over the torn place and said, "It's earned its condition." Wade, driving, glanced over. "That coat looked tired before today." "So do you," Elias said. Wade grunted, but the corner of his mouth moved. In the back seat, Tommy held the untouched water pan on his knees, as if he had personally offended it. "Maybe she didn't like the pan." "She didn't like any of us," Naomi said. "That feels more fair," Tommy murmured. The clinic was not much to look at from the road. A low tan building stood beyond a gravel lot, with rabbit brush at the fence and a faded sign that read Canyonlands Wildlife Care in green letters. Behind it were shaded pens, storage sheds, and a narrow line of cottonwoods that had found enough water underground to keep believing in leaves. Dr. Samira Klein had called ahead. A technician named Ben opened the side gate before Wade even parked. Nobody rushed. Nobody crowded the crate. The world became careful again. Inside the intake room, everything smelled of clean towels, metal, antiseptic, and hay. The Bobcat disliked it immediately. She flattened herself against the back of the crate, amber eyes bright under the harsh light. When Ben stepped too near with a clipboard, she gave one sharp cough of warning that made Tommy take half a step backward and bump into a shelf of folded towels. A stack slid sideways. Marta caught it against her chest. Graceful. "I meant to inspect them," Tommy whispered back. Even Dr. Klein smiled, but only briefly. The examination took time. A mild sedative softened the Bobcat's panic without stealing her completely from herself. Dr. Klein worked with steady hands, checking the freed paw, the tucked hind leg, the ribs beneath the dusty coat, the old nick in the left ear, and the broken whisker on the right side of her muzzle. The Bobcat was thin, dehydrated, covered in burrs, and favoring one side, but there was strength under the exhaustion. "Female," Dr. Klein said quietly. "Adult, not old. She's been managing out there a long while." Elias stood near the wall with his hat in his hands. He had been asked to wait outside once the exam began. He had done so for 12 minutes, pacing by the cottonwoods, listening to dry leaves flicker against one another. Then Naomi had come to the door and told him he could stand inside if he stayed back. He stayed back. That was harder than he expected. Not because he wanted to touch the Bobcat again. He did not. He knew better. It was harder because some part of him had carried her weight and now felt responsible for every breath she took afterward. That troubled him. A wild creature was not a promise handed to a lonely man. She was her own life, interrupted by a fallen tree. His job had been to get her from danger to help, and yet his chest still tightened whenever she stirred. Dr. Klein cleaned burrs from the fur near the Bobcat's shoulder. One burr fell to the table and stuck to the cuff of Ben's sleeve. He looked at it with grave disappointment. "Even sedated, she's delegating trouble," Marta said softly from the doorway. "She's management material," Wade replied. The Bobcat's tail tip twitched once, black against the towel. Elias noticed. He also noticed the broken whisker. It pointed forward more than the others, short and blunt, making her face look permanently skeptical. The old nick in her ear had been the first thing he saw clearly at the hollow, but the whisker was what stayed with him now. It seemed too small to matter and too specific to forget. When the exam ended, they moved her to a quiet recovery enclosure behind the clinic. Not a cage for keeping, Dr. Klein explained, but a temporary place for healing. It had shade cloth overhead, a sheltered wooden box at the back, a low branch bolted across one corner, and enough space for her to move without overusing the sore leg. The blue blanket went inside the box until proper bedding could be arranged, mostly because Marta folded her arms and looked at Dr. Klein as if luck were a medical category. "Fine," the vet said, "for tonight." Marta nodded, satisfied. They set a water pan near the entrance to the shelter. Not too close, not too far. The Bobcat woke slowly as the afternoon tilted toward evening. She did not come out of the box at first. Only her eyes showed in the shade, two narrow amber places watching the humans pretend they were not watching her. Elias sat on a bench outside the enclosure fence, 3 feet back from the barrier, because Dr. Klein had pointed to that spot and said, "There." He obeyed. The clinic yard grew quieter. A mourning dove called from the cottonwoods. Somewhere inside the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. Wind dragged the smell of dry grass through the fence wire. Elias held his chipped enamel mug in both hands, though it was empty. Wade had brought it from the truck after claiming a man looked wrong without his usual equipment. The Bobcat emerged near sundown, one paw first, then her head, then the lean, spotted line of her body. She moved stiffly, favoring the sore side, but her pride seemed entirely undamaged. She sniffed the water pan, gave it one quick swat, and tipped half the water into the dirt. Tommy, who had stayed late out of guilt toward all pans, closed his eyes. "She remembers," Marta whispered. Elias looked down into his empty mug to hide a small smile. Dr. Klein refilled the pan after everyone stepped away. The Bobcat watched from the shelter entrance. Her broken whisker angled forward. Her ears shifted toward Elias when his boots scraped lightly against gravel. He stilled at once. For a long while, nothing happened. Then the Bobcat walked to the pan again. She lifted one paw. Everyone seemed to inhale. But she did not strike it. She lowered her head and drank. Not much. Only a few careful laps, tongue quick, eyes still raised toward the fence. Then she stopped and looked directly at Elias's hands wrapped around the chipped mug. She did not blink slowly this time. She did not soften. She simply watched his hands as if deciding they belonged to the same quiet creature that had waited outside her hollow. Elias did not move. The tiny breakthrough lasted perhaps 10 seconds. To anyone else, it might have looked like almost nothing. To Elias, it felt like the first stone set correctly in a washed-out trail. Small, plain, easy to miss. But without it, nothing after could hold. Marta wrote a name on the temporary chart before leaving. Junie, she printed, then glanced at Elias as if daring him to object. He looked through the fence at the Bobcat, at the nicked ear, the dusty muzzle, the broken whisker catching the last thin light. "She'll decide what she answers to," he said. The Bobcat looked away first, toward the cottonwoods and a darkening shape of the open country beyond the clinic yard. That pleased him more than if she had looked back. Morning checks began before the clinic unlocked its front door. Elias did not plan for that to happen. The first day after Junie arrived, he drove to Monticello because Naomi had asked him to drop off the incident notes and sign the transfer form. The second day, he told himself he needed to return Marta's blue blanket, though Marta pointed out that the blanket was still inside Junie's shelter and therefore had not requested transportation. The third morning, he brought a sack of trail reports that could have waited until Friday. By the fourth morning, Dr. Klein looked at him over the top of her glasses and said, "You know you can just say you're checking on her." Elias stood in the clinic office with his hat in one hand and his chipped enamel mug in the other. "I'm checking on the paperwork." "The paperwork is eating better." He glanced toward the back door where the outdoor pen sat under shadecloth and cottonwood light. Good. Dr. Klein let him keep the small dignity of not answering more than that. Junie's enclosure rested behind the main building, between a pen used for recovering hawks and a quieter fenced run, where young raccoons had once dismantled a latch with such confidence that Ben still spoke of them like former criminals. The Bobcat space was simple, but thoughtful. A wooden shelter at the back, a low climbing branch, a shaded corner, clean bedding, a water pan she had learned to tolerate, and enough brush along the fence line to let her disappear when she wished. Most mornings, she wished. Elias sat on the same bench, 3 feet from the fence, and did not ask anything of her. He drank coffee from his chipped mug. He read trail notes. He sharpened pencils with a pocket knife, shaving curls of cedar-colored wood into a small paper sack, so nothing unfamiliar blew into her space. He never reached through the wire. He never clicked his tongue or made little coaxing sounds. He had seen people try to pull closeness from wild animals, the way children pulled ribbons from gifts, and it always made him uneasy. Care, he was learning again, could be quiet enough to be mistaken for doing nothing. Junie watched him from the shelter doorway. Sometimes only one amber eye showed. Sometimes the nicked edge of her left ear appeared first, turning toward the scrape of his boot on gravel. Her broken right whisker still gave her a stern, lopsided look. When Ben entered to change bedding or check the water, Junie slipped behind the branch and flattened into the shadows until only the black tip of her tail moved once in irritation. She disliked Ben's green rubber boots. No one knew why. Ben tried standing still. Junie stared at the boots. He tried stepping backward. She stared harder. Marta, who visited after crew shifts when she could, suggested the boots had committed a private offense. Wade said the boots probably knew what they had done. Tommy asked if he should buy different boots for Ben, and everyone turned to look at him until he muttered that he was only trying to help. Junie ignored all of them with equal skill. She did not come to him. She did not soften in any easy way, but she began to make room for his presence. On the 6th morning, she stepped out of the shelter while he was still on the bench. She stretched her forelegs, claws sliding briefly into the dirt, then arched her back in one smooth, spotted curve. She shook dust from her coat, turned her head, and inspected him, as if he had failed to impress her, but might be allowed to remain. Elias kept his eyes on the paper in his lap. Inside him, something small warmed. It embarrassed him a little. He was old enough to know better than to make a miracle out of a bobcat stretching. But loneliness had made him notice absences for so long that the presence of any living thing choosing not to flee felt larger than it should have. He thought of Claire calling on Sundays from Oregon, her voice bright with rain. He thought of Laurel, telling him that some doors opened only when a man stopped pushing on them. So he did not push. Junie's routine formed around caution. She ate best after dusk, when the clinic yard had emptied and the cottonwoods became black lace against the sky. She used the shelter when trucks passed too close on the road. She preferred the shaded back corner during wind. She scent-marked the low branch with her cheek, then glared at Ben when he wrote it down. She batted once at the water pan every afternoon before drinking. Not hard enough to spill now, just enough to remind everyone the pan's position was temporary and subject to review. The crew began bringing their small reports to the bench. Not all at once, never loudly. Marta came with trail maps rolled under one arm and sat 2 fence posts away, knitting a crooked strip of something she claimed would become a scarf if it developed ambition. Wade stopped by with a box of apples from his wife and placed one beside Elias's mug without comment. Tommy arrived once with his new gloves freshly washed, then hid them behind his back when Junie looked at him through the wire. "She knows," he whispered. "She knows everything," Marta said. Junie flicked one ear. That became the joke, though they never made it loudly. Junie knew when someone had eaten lunch too close to her fence. Junie knew when Wade's thermos contained soup instead of coffee. Junie knew when Tommy had stepped in mud and tried to scrape it off on gravel. She remained a bobcat, wary and self-contained, but the humans around her began to treat her silence as part of the day's weather. Elias's work continued. The North Ridge Trail still needed clearing. The fallen juniper had been cut and moved aside, though he left part of the root hollow undisturbed beyond the tread. Drainage dips had to be reshaped before summer storms. Stone steps near the wash needed resetting. Hikers ignored signs. Wind undid half a morning sweeping in 10 minutes. The world kept being the world, but Elias found himself listening differently. A twig snap no longer meant only a twig snap. A pocket of shade beneath roots no longer seemed empty just because he could not see into it. He walked trails with the memory of amber eyes under juniper roots, and the land around him felt less like scenery and more like a house with many closed rooms. Each evening after work, he drove home to his cabin outside Bluff. The porch step knocked under his boot. He hung his jacket on the peg, though the torn cuff now carried 4 clean claw marks he had not mended. He heated beans or soup, washed his mug, and set it upside down beside the sink. On Sunday, Claire called. He told her about the fallen tree first, then the blocked trail, then the bobcat, as if the order mattered. "You carried her?" Claire asked. "For a little ways. Dad." The one word held surprise, worry, and tenderness. "She's wild," he said quickly. "Clinic has her. Vet's handling it." He looked through the dark window at his porch light shining over the talking step. "She's got a broken whisker." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, softer, "Of course, that's what you noticed." After the call, Elias stood a long while by the kitchen counter, with the receiver still warm in his hand. The cabin did not feel full, not exactly, but the silence had changed shape. The next morning, he arrived at the clinic just after sunrise. Junie was already outside her shelter. She sat beneath the low branch, paws tucked, tail wrapped close, amber eyes fixed on the gate before he even opened it. When Elias stepped onto the gravel, her nicked ear turned toward him. She did not move away. He sat on the bench, 3 feet back. The cottonwoods stirred above them. A dove called once, then again. Sunlight reached through the shade cloth in pale squares and rested near Junie's paws. Elias took a sip from his chipped mug. Junie lowered her head and drank from the pan without striking it first. No one else saw. That was all right. Some mornings did not need witnesses. Joy came cautiously around Junie, the way everything did. It did not arrive as laughter at first. Laughter was too bright for the recovery yard, too sudden for the animal who still measured every sound with her ears and every movement with the tense line of her shoulders. It arrived instead in small accidents of light, in cottonwood leaves trembling above the shade cloth, and in the way a bobcat, who disliked being observed, somehow made everyone look away and notice her at the same time. By the second week, Junie had learned the shape of mornings. Ben came first, moving carefully in boots that were no longer green. Dr. Klein followed with her clipboard. Naomi came when patrol allowed. The trail crew arrived in pieces, never crowding, never asking for anything the bobcat had not chosen to give. Elias arrived with sunrise. He always sat on the same bench 3 feet from the fence. His chipped enamel mug balanced near his right boot, 3 pencils in his shirt pockets, hat low against the early glare. He did not call to Junie. He did not search for her if she chose the shelter. He simply became part of the morning equipment: bench, mug, fence, man. Junie seemed to accept this arrangement with the severe patience of a small canyon queen. She still vanished when strangers passed. She still flattened her ears if a truck rattled too close to the gate. She still gave the water pan 1 testing tap each afternoon. But she began to move more freely when Elias sat nearby. Once she stepped into a square of sunlight, so neatly that Marta whispered she was posing for a painting no one was allowed to make. One morning, Elias set his mug on the ground while he bent to retie a bootlace. The mug was empty, but it still carried the smell of bitter grounds and camp smoke from 100 workdays. Laurel had bought it years before because the blue rim matched the desert sky after rain. The crack near the handle had darkened over time, like a little river on a map. Junie noticed it. She had been pacing the fence line in the deliberate way bobcats patrol even a temporary world. Her paws made almost no sound on the packed dirt. She paused opposite the mug and lowered her head. Her broken whisker angled forward. Her nose worked. Elias froze with one hand on his bootlace. Marta, sitting 2 fence posts away with her crooked knitting, stopped mid-stitch. Tommy, pretending to read a trail manual, lowered it just enough to watch. Wade leaned against the gate with an apple in his hand and did not bite it. Junie extended one paw through the lowest gap beneath the fence. Not far, just enough. Her paw touched the dirt outside the enclosure, then withdrew. A small print remained beside the mug, perfect and dusty, 4 rounded toes and a pad like a quiet signature. Elias looked at it. Then he looked at Junie. She looked back. The paw print was so small beside the mug that it should not have mattered. It was not affection. It was not greeting. Junie had merely investigated something that smelled of the man who kept returning without reaching. And yet, Elias felt a warmth rise in him so sudden and simple that it nearly hurt. For years, the space around his belongings had been undisturbed. His mug stayed where he put it. His boots dried alone. Now, a wild paw print had appeared beside something he had carried through grief, work, winter, and ordinary mornings, and the mark made the mug look less lonely. Marta pressed her lips together. Tommy's shoulders shook once. Wade turned away and bit into his apple with unnecessary seriousness. Elias lowered his boot slowly and tied the lace without brushing the print away. "She missed the mug," Wade said at last. "On purpose," Marta whispered. Tommy nodded. "She's warning it." Junie walked back to her branch, tail tip twitching. She rubbed one cheek along the bark, leaving her scent. Then she sat and washed one forepaw with quick, precise strokes, as if the entire incident had been beneath her. That became the morning everyone remembered when the yard felt too quiet. The joy did not stop there. It gathered in little pieces. Junie developed a habit of dragging one strip of bedding out of her shelter each morning and leaving it in the same sunny spot. Then put it back. Junie dragged it out again. After 3 days, Dr. Klein declared the sunny spot officially part of the shelter system. She also disliked Marta's knitting. Whenever Marta worked the needles, Junie watched with grave suspicion until Marta stopped. Then Junie looked away. When Marta started again, Junie turned back. This happened 6 times before Wade said, "She's supervising quality." Marta held up the uneven strip. "Then she's right to worry." Even Naomi smiled when Junie hid her empty dish behind the low branch after eating. She did it with great seriousness, pushing the dish backward with one paw until it scraped against the wood. The first time, Tommy whispered, "Evidence removed," and Ben had to step outside to laugh quietly behind the feed shed. Elias did not laugh much, but his eyes changed. The lines beside them softened. Junie had not filled the cabin waiting for him at night, but she had changed the silence he carried back to it. Junie remained wild through all of it. That mattered. She did not curl against the fence. She did not seek hands. If a stranger came too close to the back gate, Junie vanished into her shelter so completely that only the nicked tip of her ear showed in the darkness. The cottonwoods shifted overhead. The recovery yard smelled of warm dust, dry leaves, clean water, and the faint sharp musk Junie left on the branch. Near his boot, the old paw print had blurred at the edges, softened by wind and passing shadows. At last, Elias picked up his mug and ran his thumb along the cracked blue rim. "Maybe because she did," he said, though no one had asked the question aloud. Inside the enclosure, Junie stepped out from her shelter, crossed to the water pan, and drank without striking it. Then she looked once toward Elias, blinked against the sun, and turned back to her own quiet business. The crew did not speak. They did not need to. For a little while, the clinic yard felt full. The first warning came as a silence in the canyon. Elias noticed it 3 mornings before anyone said the word trouble. He had driven out to the North Ridge Trail with Wade and Tommy to reset a run of stone steps below the old Juniper Hollow. The air was warmer than it had been the week before, and the desert had begun to carry that dry spring smell of dust, sun-warmed bark, and sage rubbed open by wind. Far below, the wash curved pale and empty between the rocks. Usually there were sounds, ravens arguing over nothing, lizards ticking through brittle grass, the faint chatter of hikers somewhere beyond the bend. That morning, the ridge held itself too still. Elias stood near the place where the fallen juniper had been cut and moved aside. Part of the torn root hollow remained beyond the trail edge, shaded and untouched, just as he had left it. He looked at the dark pocket beneath the roots and remembered amber eyes staring out from there. Wade set down a rock bar. "You hearing anything?" "That's the thing," Elias said. Tommy, who had grown more careful since the rescue, stopped sorting wedges. "No birds." "Not close," Elias said. A gust came over the mesa and moved through the junipers without stirring much else. Dust lifted around their boots. Somewhere far away, a raven called once, then quit. They worked anyway, because work did not stop every time the land felt uneasy. Elias reset stones by hand, fitting each one into the trail like a thought he wanted to keep. Wade tamped gravel. Tommy swept loose sand with the seriousness of a man trying to prove he had learned patience. By noon, they found the tracks. Naomi saw them first when she arrived from the lower gate. She crouched near a sandy patch by the fence line and did not speak for a moment. She rubbed her cheek along the low branch, then returned and did it again, laying her scent over the bark with unusual insistence. At dusk, she stood with her head lifted toward the fence, nostrils working, tail tip barely moving. Dr. Klein watched from beside Elias's bench. She smells something. Coyotes? Maybe weather. The sky had changed too. Clouds gathered over the far western rim in bruised blue layers, not storming yet, only promising to. The clinic yard smelled of cottonwood leaves, metal fencing, and the mineral sharpness that sometimes came before rain in dry country. Junie disliked it. She moved from shelter to branch to fence corner, never settling long. Marta tried to bring cheer with a paper sack of biscuits from town. Junie ignored the humans, but the smell made Ben look hopeful. Marta handed him one, for morale. Ben accepted it with both hands. Mine or hers? Whichever improves first. Wade took two and claimed one was for his wife, though everyone watched him eat both before leaving the yard. Tommy brought a replacement water pan because the old one had a dent from Junie's early opinions. Junie sniffed the new pan, tapped it once, and walked away, as if refusing to endorse unnecessary spending. The little warmth helped, but it did not erase the unease. That evening, Elias stayed later than usual. He sat on the bench with his mug empty between his boots. Junie paced the inside fence line. Each pass brought her close, then away, close, then away. Her broken whisker caught the dim light whenever she turned her head. The nick in her left ear tilted toward the hills again and again. Elias had seen animals restless before weather. He had seen them restless before danger. The hard part was not knowing which kind of warning he was watching. Inside his chest, the old helplessness stirred. Laurel's illness had taught him that some things announced themselves before they arrived. A tiredness that lasted too long, a cough that did not belong to winter, a look between doctors before anyone used plain words. Since then, Elias had distrusted early signs because they made a man responsible before he understood what he was responsible for. Junie stopped across from him. She did not come near the fence. She simply stood with all four paws square beneath her, lean body outlined against the shelter's shadow. Her eyes were not soft. They were alert, sharp, measuring the world beyond him. Then she made a sound Elias had not heard from her before. Not a hiss, not the rough complaint from the day he carried her. A low, short bark, almost swallowed before it left her throat. Dr. Klein came out at once. Junie turned toward the back corner of the yard. The cottonwoods moved there, leaves flashing pale underneath as the wind changed. Beyond the fence, near the dry grass by the shed, something small darted and vanished. Ben lifted his flashlight. Nothing showed but brush, shadow, and the thin curve of a track in loose soil. Naomi was called. The enclosure latches were checked twice. The outer gate was secured. Motion lights were tested. Wade and Tommy walked the perimeter with Dr. Klein, while Marta stood beside Elias, arms folded against the cooling air. She knows before we do, Marta said. Elias watched Junie return to her shelter without lying down. Yes, he said, she does. Later, when he drove home, the road unrolled pale under his headlights. Dust blew sideways across the beams. At the cabin, the porch step gave its familiar knock beneath his boot. but the sound did not comfort him the way it usually did. He left his jacket on the peg and stood by the window with the lights off. The mesas were only dark shapes. Somewhere beyond them, a wild bobcat stood awake in a recovery enclosure, reading the night through scent and silence. Elias picked up his chipped mug, then set it down again. For the first time since the rescue, he wished Junie could tell him what she feared. And for the first time, he feared the answer might already be moving toward them through the brush. The storm arrived after midnight, without the mercy of rain at first. It came as wind. A hard, restless wind pushed down from the mesa and struck the clinic yard in long, invisible shoulders, rattling the shade cloth, worrying the cottonwood leaves, and lifting dust into the beam of the security light until the whole back lot seemed filled with pale, moving ghosts. The sheds creaked. The fence wires hummed faintly. Somewhere near the storage pen, a loose bucket rolled once, knocked against a post, and went still. Junie heard it all. She had spent the evening in the back corner of her enclosure, with her body low, and her ears moving separately, one toward the clinic, one toward the open country beyond the fence. She had not eaten until Dr. Klein dimmed the yard light. She had touched the new water pan twice before drinking, as if asking whether it planned to behave during weather. Then she had dragged the edge of Marta's blue blanket halfway out of the shelter and left it in the dirt. Ben had found that funny when he did the last check. "She's redecorating before the storm," he said. Dr. Klein had looked at Junie, then at the sky. Or packing. Ben stopped smiling quite so much. By 10 o'clock, Naomi had driven over after patrol and walked the perimeter again with a flashlight. No tracks near the outer gate, no loosened wire, no sign of coyotes in the yard itself. The latches held, the locks held. Still, Junie watched from inside the shelter, without lying down. Elias had not been there. Dr. Klein had told him to go home before dark. She had said it kindly but firmly, the way people spoke to men who were trying not to admit they were tired. He had stood outside the enclosure for one more minute, mug in one hand, hat in the other, while Junie's amber eyes glowed from the shelter's shadow. "She'll be safer with fewer people around," Dr. Klein had said. "I know." And he did know. Knowing had never made leaving easier. At the cabin, Elias slept badly. Wind pressed at the walls and made the stovepipe tick. The porch step knocked once by itself, a small hollow sound that woke him from a dream he could not remember. For a moment, he thought Laurel had come in late and missed the board with her heel. Then the room settled into darkness, and he remembered where he was, who was gone, and what creature stood restless miles away under a clinic light. He rose before the alarm. At 4:30, the house was cold enough that his breath showed faintly near the sink. He filled the kettle, then forgot to light the burner. He stood with one hand on the counter, looking at the chipped enamel mug as if it might tell him whether worry was useful. It was not. He lit the stove anyway. By 5, he was driving toward Monticello with his headlights cutting through dust and low scraps of cloud. The road felt longer than usual. Wind shoved at the truck broadside. Rabbit brush bent silver in the dark. The first thin line of dawn had not yet touched the mesas. When Elias pulled into the clinic lot, Ben's truck was already there. That was wrong. Ben did not arrive before Elias unless something needed doing. Elias parked crooked and got out without taking his coffee. The wind slapped cold dust against his face. From behind the clinic came the sound of a gate chain striking metal again and again. Ben appeared around the side of the building, with his jacket half-zipped and his hair flattened on one side. "Elias," he said. The name was enough. Elias walked past him. Dr. Klein stood at Junie's enclosure with a flashlight in her hand, though dawn was beginning to gray the yard. Naomi was there too, kneeling near the gate, one palm hovering over the dirt without touching it. Marta's blue blanket lay inside the shelter entrance, twisted and empty. The low branch was scraped fresh along one side. The water pan sat upright, untouched, as if even in leaving, Junie had refused to give it the satisfaction of drama. The latch on the inner gate was bent, not open wide, bent. The lower hook had been forced against the frame, just enough to leave a gap where a lean, determined body might push through if fear, instinct, or urgency gave it the strength. A small tuft of tawny fur clung to a rough edge of wire near the bottom. Elias stopped at the fence. For a second, he could not understand the shape of the empty space. Junie had always been hard to see when she chose shadow. His eyes searched the shelter, the branch, the back corner, the strip of brush along the fence. He waited for the nicked left ear to appear. He waited for the broken whisker to angle forward in judgment. He waited for the insulted twitch of her tail. Nothing moved. Only the blue blanket breathed slightly in the wind. "She's gone," Dr. Klein said. Her voice was steady, but not untouched. Elias looked at the latch again. "Coyotes?" "Something came close," Naomi said. "Tracks by the outer fence. She may have panicked, or she may have tried to get ahead of it." Ben swallowed. "The motion light went out around 2. Breaker tripped. I found it when I came in." No one blamed him. That was its own mercy. Storms found weak places in systems and people alike. Marta arrived then, breathless from the lot, still wearing the sweater she must have pulled on in the dark. Wade came behind her with Tommy, both silent. Tommy had mismatched gloves on, one old, one new. On another morning, someone might have noticed kindly. On this one, no one had the room. Marta saw the empty shelter and pressed one hand to her mouth. Wade took off his hat. Tommy whispered, "She was still healing." Elias heard the words but did not answer. His mind had gone back to the Juniper hollow, to the weight of her inside his jacket, to the paw pressed lightly against the canvas before he lowered her into the crate. He had told himself then that she belonged to no one. He had believed it. He still believed it. But belief did not stop the sharp ache that came when a living presence vanished from a place where the heart had begun, foolishly or not, to look for it. Naomi pointed her flashlight toward the dirt beyond the gate. "Tracks head east first." "Toward the wash," Elias said. "Yes." The sky brightened by one shade. The cottonwoods shook hard above them, leaves flashing pale. Somewhere beyond the clinic fence, a coyote called once, thin and far enough away to be almost imagined. Junie's empty dish lay hidden behind the branch where she had pushed it the night before. Tommy saw it and bent as if to pick it up, then stopped himself. "Leave it," Elias said softly. Tommy straightened. Elias stepped close to the fence but did not touch the tuft of fur. He only looked at it. A small wild thing had made a choice in the dark, under wind, under threat, under a sky that gave no explanation. Maybe she had fled. Maybe she had fought the latch until it yielded. Maybe the scent of coyotes had driven her toward the only world she trusted more than confinement. The crew gathered behind him and fell into the same silence they had held on the ridge. Only this time, Elias carried nothing. That was what made it unbearable. They began at the fence, because Naomi said every search had to begin where the truth last touched the ground. The dirt beneath the bent latch held too many marks. Human boots had crossed there during the first panic. Wind had combed the dust into shallow ridges. But Naomi worked slowly, crouched with her flashlight angled low, reading what remained the way Elias read a broken trail. Junie had pushed out close to the bottom hinge. Her prints were faint but there, small and rounded, pressed deeper on the right, where she still favored the sore side. She had paused beyond the gate, turned once toward the clinic yard, then gone east along the fence before cutting toward rabbit brush. She didn't bolt straight, Naomi said. Elias held his hat in both hands. She thought first. Looks like it. That hurt more than panic would have. Junie had not run blindly. Even sore, even under wind, she had chosen cover, shadow, and direction. They searched in widening lines. Dr. Klein stayed at the clinic in case Junie circled back, then checked the outer pens and the culvert near the road. Naomi led Elias, Wade, Marta, and Tommy toward the dry wash east of the property. The sky had turned pewter gray. Wind dragged the smell of damp stone from clouds that still refused to rain. No one called Junie's name loudly. They did not whistle or crash through brush. Naomi reminded them that a bobcat in fear would hide from noise, not come toward it. So they moved as if entering a sleeping house. Tommy carried the dented old water pan in his pack because he could not bear leaving with empty hands. It knocked once against his canteen, and he whispered an apology to both objects. Wade heard him and said nothing, which was kinder than teasing. Marta carried the blue blanket from the shelter after Dr. Klein said it might hold familiar scent. A few tawny hairs clung to the wool. She kept touching them with her thumb. Elias carried his torn jacket. The cuff still held the 4 claw marks from the hollow rescue. He had not washed it. It smelled of dust, sweat, old coffee, sun-warmed canvas, and if he let himself imagine it, juniper roots. He hated that he hoped the scent mattered. He hated more that it might not. Near the first bend of the wash, Naomi found another track, then another. Junie had stepped down the bank where pale sand gathered between stones. Her prints were light, careful, closer together than they should have been. She had been conserving strength. Once, beside a clump of brittle grass, there was a mark where her hip had brushed the soil. Elias knelt and looked at it until the shape blurred. "She rested here?" Tommy asked softly. "Maybe paused," Naomi said. "Not long." The wash smelled of cold dust and creosote. A raven passed overhead without calling. The silence that had worried Elias on the ridge seemed to have followed them here. By mid-morning, they found coyote tracks crossing Junie's trail. Wade swore under his breath, then looked ashamed of it. Naomi studied the prints. They crossed after her, hard to say how close. Elias looked toward the brush-choked curve ahead. He thought of Junie's low bark in the clinic yard, the way her ears had split their attention between people and night. She had known enough to fear what moved beyond the fence. Perhaps the enclosure was healing her body, but not answering the command inside her. Hide, move, live. They followed until the wash divided. One branch turned toward the highway culvert. The other climbed toward broken sandstone and scattered junipers. Naomi chose the sandstone first. Junie would prefer cover and height if she had the strength. Elias agreed without speaking. The climb was slow. Red mud clung to their boots where the first light rain finally began. It darkened the stones and brought the smell of minerals up from the ground. Marta slipped once, and Wade caught her elbow with the hand holding an apple his wife had packed before dawn. "Emergency ration," Wade said. "For you or Morel?" Marta asked. Wade broke the bruised apple in half and handed one piece to Tommy. Nobody laughed, but the small kindness moved through them. They found no den, no sign of a final struggle. Only tracks appearing and vanishing where stone interrupted sand, then appearing again, fainter, higher, farther from the clinic. At noon, Dr. Klein called Naomi's radio. A rancher 2 miles south had seen a bobcat cross a service road before dawn, moving low and fast, favoring one side. Alive then. Possibly Junie, maybe not. The uncertainty was a cruel little door left half open. Relief came first, sharp and almost painful. Then fear followed it, because alive before dawn did not mean safe by noon. They widened the search toward the service road. Rain thickened to a cold mist. The blue blanket grew damp over Marta's arm. Tommy's mismatched gloves darkened at the fingertips. Elias's jacket took the wet slowly, smelling stronger as it did. By late afternoon, the tracks were gone. The ground turned rocky near a stand of junipers that leaned away from the wind. Naomi circled twice. Elias climbed above the wash and scanned every ledge, hollow, and shadow that might hold amber eyes. Once, he thought he saw the nicked ear beneath a shrub and felt his whole body answer. It was only a broken branch. Before leaving, Tommy set the dented pan on a flat rock and filled it with water. "For if she comes this way," he said. Naomi did not tell him it was unlikely. Elias placed his torn jacket beside the pan, under the deepest part of the branches where the rain touched it least. He knew it was not a plan. Some gestures were not solutions. They were prayers made by hands that did not know how to pray. When they hiked back, the wash was already softening their footprints behind them. The lamb did not keep records for human grief. At the clinic, Junie's enclosure looked larger without her. The low branch waited. The hidden dish waited. The sunny spot where she had dragged bedding waited. Elias stood outside the fence until dusk made the wire disappear. He had carried her once. Now there was nothing to carry. The empty bench, the chipped mug in his hand, and the understanding that loving a wild creature meant the heart could be left open to a country too wide to search completely. Junie returned on the 5th evening, when the rain had passed and the desert held the clean smell that came after weather. The North Ridge Trail was still damp in the shaded bends. Drops clung to juniper needles and fell now and then with small, patient ticks onto the stone steps Elias had reset days before. The air had turned cool enough that every breath felt washed. Far west, the clouds were breaking apart, and the last light moved along the sandstone in long copper bands. The search had become quieter by then. No one had said they were getting up. Not directly. Dr. Klein still left the side gate checked but unlatched, with a camera watching the approach. Ben still refreshed water near the brush line behind the clinic. Tommy still carried the dented pan in his pack, though it had begun to sound less like hope and more like a small bell for grief. Marta still brought the blue blanket to the trail truck each time they came back empty. But the spaces between words had grown longer. Elias had gone back to work because the trail still needed hands. A washout below the ridge had widened after the storm, and the closure signs had to be moved. Naomi came with him, partly for the work, and partly because neither of them could stop scanning the edges of the land. Wade and Marta followed with tools. Tommy walked behind them with his mismatched gloves. The place where Junie had first been found looked different after rain. The fallen juniper's cut trunk had darkened. The root hollows smelled of wet bark and mineral soil. Tiny green shoots had appeared in a crack where Elias would have sworn nothing soft could grow. He stood there longer than he meant to. Naomi noticed, but did not hurry him. Elias remembered her weight in his jacket. He remembered the paw against the canvas. He remembered telling himself she belonged to no one, and he still believed it with all the honest parts of him. Yet he also knew the heart did not obey wisdom cleanly. It kept listening after the song had stopped. Wade cleared his throat. "We've got enough light for one more drainage cut." "Then one more," Elias said. They worked until the sun rested low behind the mesa. The crew's movements were tired but familiar. Marta marked a reroute with orange flags that snapped softly in the damp breeze. Wade tamped gravel with steady strokes. Tommy finally spoke when a flag stuck to his sleeve and followed him 3 steps. "I've been adopted by survey tape," he said. Marta looked up. "It makes bold choices." "Better than the water pan," Wade said. Tommy almost smiled. Almost. Elias was kneeling beside the trail edge, clearing mud from a shallow channel with a hand trowel, when Naomi raised her hand. The gesture was small. Everyone stopped. At first, Elias heard only water dripping from needles and the thin whisper of wind through pinon branches. Then came another sound, a scrape. Not boot on stone, not tool, something light shifting on wet sand. Elias turned slowly toward the old root hollow. Junie stood 20 yards away on the ridge trail. For a moment, she seemed made from the evening itself. Tawny coat, dark spots, pale chin, black-tipped bobbed tail held low. Her left ear still carried the little nick. Her broken right whisker angled forward, stern and unmistakable. She was thinner than Elias wished, damp along the legs, and she favored one side. But she stood with the fierce balance of a creature who had crossed fear and arrived on her own terms. Nobody moved. The trail crew paused, as if the whole day had been built for that silence. Elias did not say her name. His throat had closed around it anyway. Junie looked at Naomi first, then Marta, then Wade and Tommy, each human measured and dismissed in turn. Last, her eyes settled on Elias. They were not soft. They were not grateful. They were alive, alert, and full of decisions no person had permission to read. Elias lowered the trowel to the ground. The metal touched stone with a tiny click. Junie's ears twitched, but she did not run. Marta's hand tightened around the folded blue blanket. Wade removed his hat. Tommy slowly slid the dented water pan from his pack and held it against his chest, then seemed to realize how foolish he looked and held it anyway. Behind Junie, the rabbit brush moved. Elias saw it. So did Naomi. A small motion, low to the ground, gone before shape became certainty. Junie turned her head halfway back, not enough to reveal what was behind her, only enough to tell the brush to be still. It was such a precise, commanding movement that Elias felt the breath leave him. She was not simply returning from fear. She was returning with a purpose. Naomi whispered, "Everyone stay where you are." No one needed telling twice. Junie stepped forward once. Her paw touched the damp trail and left a clear print in the fine mud near the stone Elias had set that morning. She sniffed the air. Her nose lifted toward him, catching whatever remained of coffee, canvas, rain, and all dust. Then she looked past him, toward the place under the juniper where she had once been trapped. Elias understood then that the trail had become part of her map too. Not home, perhaps, not safety in any simple human sense, but a place marked by memory, a place where pain had opened and hands had not taken more than they had to, a place where fear had been met with patience 3 feet at a time. He remained kneeling because standing felt too large. "Easy," he said, so softly the word barely crossed the space. Junie blinked against the low sun. Then, with deliberate calm, she walked off the trail and into the juniper shade. The brush behind her stirred again, smaller this time, quick as a heartbeat under leaves. Tommy's eyes widened, but Wade laid one hand gently on his shoulder before sound could escape him. Junie paused at the edge of shadow. She looked back once. Not long, only enough. Then she vanished between the wet branches, carrying the silence with her, leaving one perfect paw print on the repaired trail, and 5 humans standing as if they had just been trusted with a secret too fragile to name. The crew did not follow Junie into the juniper shade. That became the first act of healing. Every person on the ridge wanted to move closer. Tommy wanted to see what had stirred in the brush. Marta wanted to make sure Junie was not hurt worse than she looked. Wade wanted to check the slope for coyotes before the light failed. Naomi wanted information. Elias wanted nothing and everything at once. He wanted to know she was all right. He wanted the wild to open a little window and let him look inside. Instead, he stayed on one knee beside the damp trail, his hand near the trowel and his breath held behind his teeth. Junie had disappeared so completely that the shadows seemed to have swallowed her. Only the paw print remained, pressed cleanly into the mud near the stone step he had set that morning. A drop of water fell from a juniper needle and darkened the edge of it. Naomi lowered her hand only after a minute had passed. "Back out slow," she said. No one argued. They packed their tools like people leaving a sleeping room. Metal did not clang. Buckles were held still. Tommy slid the dented water pan into his pack without letting it knock against the canteen. Marta folded the blue blanket, then stopped, looked toward the trees, and set it beneath a ledge where rain could not reach it. Just in case she hates it less outdoors, she said. Wade nodded solemnly. Medical reasoning. That small scrap of humor passed between them, thin but warm. At the trailhead, Naomi made the plan. They would keep the ridge closed. They would place cameras at a distance, not near the hollow. They would set water far from the trail, under cover, only until they knew Junie had found natural sources again. Dr. Klein would advise, but no one would trap her unless she was clearly failing. No one would feed her into dependence. No one would turn the ridge into a spectacle. She came back here by choice, Naomi said. We respect that. Elias stood beside the truck. And if she's hurt, then we watch carefully enough to know the difference between worry and need. She did not soften the answer. He appreciated that. For the next several days, healing became a thing done at the edge of sight. Elias returned to the ridge each morning with Naomi or Dr. Klein, never alone and never close to the hollow. They checked distant cameras, read tracks after sunrise, and repaired closure signs hikers kept trying to understand creatively. The air warmed again. Wet earth gave way to dust. The junipers dried, lifting their sharp scent whenever wind moved through them. Junie appeared first as evidence, a clear print in the sand beside the wash, still favoring one side, but less heavily than before. A scrape on a fallen branch where she had rubbed her cheek. A tuft of pale underfur caught on rabbit brush, not torn, only shed. Once, the camera caught her at 3:17 in the morning, crossing a moonlit patch near the old root hollow. Her eyes glowed white. Her head was low. Her gait was careful but steady. Behind her, something smaller seemed to move and vanish. Tommy saw it when they reviewed the footage in the clinic office. There, he whispered. Naomi paused the video. The image was grainy. Brush, shadow, a blur too low to name. Marta leaned closer. Could be a rabbit. Wade squinted. Could be Tommy's imagination. It wanders loose. Tommy did not smile. Maybe. Elias said nothing. His hands rested around his chipped mug, and he felt the warmth of the coffee fading into his palms. Dr. Klein looked at him. We don't assume. No, Elias said. We don't. But his heart had already heard the faint rustle behind Junie on the ridge, and the heart was a poor student when hope entered the room. They kept their distance anyway. That was the promise they made without ceremony. Elias helped build a brush screen along the rerouted trail so hikers could not see into the hollow from above. Wade hauled deadfall into place, muttering that Junie had become the most demanding supervisor he had ever worked under. Marta tied closure ribbons and replaced a bright orange one with duller tape because no self-respecting Bobcat wanted emergency colors flapping over her private hillside. Tommy painted a small sign that read, Trail Restoration Area. Please stay en route. His letters leaned uphill. Naomi said they had character. Tommy stood taller all morning. Elias reset the stones near the bend so water would drain away from the hidden slope. He worked slowly, choosing each rock by feel. The stone was warm on top and cool underneath. Grit settled in the cracks of his knuckles. Every so often, he looked toward the junipers, not searching exactly, only acknowledging. He found his torn jacket on the fourth day. It was still under the branches where he had left it during the search, damp at the hem, dust stiff now, and marked with 2 new paw prints across one sleeve. Not large, not heavy. Junie's, perhaps, or not. The canyon did not sign affidavits. Elias picked it up and held it for a moment. A beetle crawled from the cuff, indignant at eviction. Wade, watching, said, Looks occupied. Everybody's got opinions on my coat, Elias replied. The crew laughed quietly, and the sound carried more relief than noise. That evening, Elias drove home with the jacket on the passenger seat. At the cabin, the porch step knocked beneath him. He stood there in the blue dusk, listening to dry grass move and thinking about the strange shape love had taken in his life. He had once believed holding on proved devotion. Laurel's last months had taught him otherwise. Claire's leaving had taught him again. Now a bobcat with a nicked ear and a broken whisker was teaching him in the language of distance, tracks, and choosing. To care was not always to call something closer. Sometimes it was to fix the trail away from its doorway. Sometimes it was to leave water where no one would see her drink. Sometimes it was to accept one paw print on an old sleeve as enough. Before bed, Claire called and listened while he told her only what was certain. "She came back," he said. "That's enough for tonight," Claire answered. He looked out at the porch light, at the crooked step, at the jacket hanging once more from its peg. "Yes," he said, and for that night it was. The first kitten appeared in the camera footage as a pair of ears, not even a full face at first. Just two small, triangular points rising behind a stone near the old Juniper hollow, then dropping out of sight as quickly as they had come. Naomi almost missed it. The clip had been taken before dawn, when the ridge was washed in grainy silver, and the camera caught more moths than mysteries. A rabbit moved through the lower right corner. Junie crossed after it without chasing, her body low and her head turning once toward the brush. Then the ears appeared. Naomi froze the frame. Inside the clinic office, everyone leaned in. Tommy's nose nearly touched the monitor. Marta held both hands over her mouth, though this time she was smiling behind them. Wade squinted as if the truth might be improved by suspicion. Dr. Klein stood with her arms folded, quiet and careful. Elias did not move. For a moment, he trusted neither his eyes nor the sudden tightening in his throat. Naomi replayed the clip. Junie stepped past the hollow, paused, and looked back. The brush stirred, two ears rose. A small spotted forehead followed. Then the little shape vanished behind a stone, clumsy and quick, like a secret trying to walk. Tommy whispered, "That is not a rabbit." "No," Dr. Klein said softly, "that is not a rabbit." No one celebrated loudly. The room seemed to understand on its own that joy, in this case, needed a quiet voice. A bobcat mother had brought her hidden world near the place where humans had once helped her. That did not make the kittens theirs to see. It did not make Junie tame. It did not mean the story had turned simple. It meant she had survived with more than herself to protect. Elias stared at the paused image until the little ears blurred. He thought of the night Junie escaped, of the bent latch, of the fur caught on wire, of how fear had driven her not away from life, but toward it. She had not merely returned because of memory. She had returned because the ridge held shelter, cover, old roots, and perhaps some scent of the man who had not taken what he could have taken. The knowledge humbled him. Later that morning, Naomi led only Elias and Dr. Klein to check the distant cameras. Marta, Wade, and Tommy stayed back at the truck by agreement, though Tommy looked as if remaining behind required more bravery than walking into danger. He held the dented water pan in both hands until Wade gently removed it and set it on the tailgate. "Let the pan rest," Wade said. "It's emotionally involved," Tommy replied. Marta patted the pan once. The ridge smelled of warming stone, dry juniper bark, and the faint sweetness of damp grass left from the storm. Sunlight came through the branches in broken gold. The old hollow lay in shade, its torn roots now settled into the slope like part of the land's memory. They stayed far back. Naomi checked the camera card with slow hands. Dr. Klein scanned the ground for signs that would tell her whether Junie was moving well. Elias stood beside a pinyon and kept his boots planted, though every part of him wanted to look under every bush. A sound came from the juniper shade, Tiny. A dry leaf ticked against stone, followed by a small scrambling rustle. She stepped from behind the fallen trunk and stopped in a shaft of light. Her coat looked fuller now that it was clean of clinic dust, though she remained lean. The nick in her left ear showed clearly. Her broken whisker still pointed forward in that stern, uneven way. She looked directly at the three humans and held them there with her amber stare. Naomi lowered her gaze. Dr. Klein did the same. Elias looked toward Junie's paws, not her eyes. He felt the old lesson return. Do not make yourself larger than the moment allows. Junie gave one low sound, not quite a growl, not quite the bark from the clinic yard. A warning, a boundary drawn. Then the brush beside her trembled. One kitten tumbled into view. It was small enough to make the stones look enormous. Tawny gray, faintly spotted, round-faced, with ears too large for its head and a short tail that jerked as it tried to regain balance. It landed on its own front paws, blinked at the world, and immediately tried to climb over a twig that was clearly more ambitious than expected. Marta would have laughed if she had been there. Elias nearly did, but the sound stayed warm and silent in his chest. The kitten froze when Junie turned her head. Then it hurried back toward her and tucked itself behind one spotted leg. Junie did not nuzzle it like a house cat in a storybook. She simply shifted her stance, placing her body between the kitten and the humans. Protection, not performance. A second kitten appeared behind the root, then a third. The third had a pale patch across its muzzle and moved with bold, foolish confidence until it saw Elias's boot from a distance and reversed so quickly it sat down. Dr. Klein's eyes softened. 3. Naomi touched 2 fingers to her radio, but did not speak into it. Junie glanced back toward the hollow. A fourth kitten crawled from the shadow, smaller than the others, shaking one paw as if offended by a piece of bark stuck between its toes. It batted the bark twice, missed both times, then looked surprised that the bark had not fled. Elias felt something inside him open so gently that it was almost painful. All those mornings beside the fence, all those paw prints near his mug, all that worrying and searching. And Junie had been carrying a whole future beneath her ribs, or hidden close in the land, while the humans guessed at only half the story. He thought of Claire as a child, asleep in the cabin, with one hand curled around a pencil. He thought of Laurel, standing in the doorway, watching them both with that quiet look that meant happiness frightened her, because it could be lost. He understood that feeling now, as the kittens shifted in the juniper shade. Joy was not safe. It was only worth it. Junie turned away first. One by one, the kittens followed. Not neatly. One climbed over another. One tried to pounce on Junie's tail and received a look from its mother that stopped it mid-hop. The smallest tripped over the blue blanket Marta had left beneath the ledge, then sat on it as if claiming ancient territory. Elias would tell Marta that part later, softly, only when they were far from the hollow. Junie paused before disappearing. She looked back toward Elias, not long enough to invite, only long enough to acknowledge the boundary still held. Then she led her kittens into the shade. The ridge seemed brighter after she was gone. Settled life did not look like keeping Junie close. It looked like orange flags moved farther down the slope. It looked like a new bend in the trail, cut carefully around the ridge, so hikers would never know what lay behind the junipers unless the canyon itself chose to tell them. It looked like Wade hauling stones until his shoulders ached, Marta brushing footprints from a sandy edge with a pine branch, Tommy painting a second sign because the first one leaned uphill so badly that even he admitted it looked seasick. Trail restoration area, please stay en route. The words were plain. That was the point. No mention of bobcats. No promise of secret babies in the shade. No invitation for cameras, whispers, or curious feet. Naomi said people protected best what they did not know to chase. Elias agreed. He worked the reroute as if repairing something inside himself. Every stone step he set farther from the hollow felt like a sentence spoken gently to the ridge. Not here. Not closer. Let them be. The kittens grew in glimpses. Never every day. Never on command. They appeared in the corners of distant camera footage, in soft prints beside Junie's cleaner ones, in the brief movement of grass where nothing else should have moved. The bold kitten with the pale muzzle became the easiest to recognize because it was always a half step too far from caution. The smallest one left tiny drag marks where it carried bits of bark, apparently determined to relocate the forest one piece at a time. One kitten pounced on its own shadow in a patch of sun and fell sideways with such surprise that Naomi had to turn away from the monitor before her smile became too large. Junie remained Junie. She hunted at dusk and before dawn. She kept to cover when voices carried from the trail. She sometimes paused near the old hollow, ears high, tail low, body still as carved wood, while the kittens tumbled badly behind her. She corrected them without fuss, a head turn, a step sideways, a low sound. The small bodies would freeze, then scatter into shade like leaves blown under a door. Once, Elias saw her from the reroute at a distance. He had been alone, only in the sense that no other person stood near him. Naomi was below the bend, and Wade was loading tools at the truck. Elias had stayed to check a drainage cut after a short afternoon shower. The air smelled of wet dust and sage. Sunlight broke through clouds in pale strips. Junie stood across the wash on a red stone ledge. She was not near the den. She was not asking for help. Her amber eyes rested on him with that old, measuring look, the broken whisker still giving her face its skeptical angle. For a moment, Elias felt the morning bench return to him, the chipped mug near his boot, the paw print beside it, the patience of 3 feet. He did not raise a hand. He did not speak. He only stood still. After a few breaths, Junie turned and slipped behind rabbit brush. A kitten's tail flicked after her, then vanished. That was the whole visit. It stayed with him for days. At the clinic, the empty enclosure was cleaned and left ready for another animal that might meet it. Ben found Junie's hidden dish behind the low branch and carried it to the sink like a relic. Marta took her blue blanket home at last, though it had a ragged corner where one of the kittens had worried it loose. She said she would wash it. Then she did not wash it for 2 weeks. Tommy kept a dented water pan in the truck, officially for emergencies, unofficially because Hope had weight and he liked knowing where it was. The crew changed too, though no one announced it. They spoke softer near brush. They noticed shade pockets beneath roots. They stopped leaving apple cores by the trail, not because they had ever meant harm, but because Junie had made every careless habit feel visible. Wade began carrying extra trash sacks. Marta added wildlife notes to the work log in the margins. Tommy learned to identify bobcat tracks from coyote prints and corrected a hiker once with such shy pride that Elias pretended not to hear. He did it on a Sunday morning, after Claire called from Oregon and told him she might come in August if the field season allowed. He did not ask twice. He only said the cabin would be there. After the call ended, he carried his toolbox outside, lifted the old board, and replaced the cracked support beneath it. The work took 20 minutes. The thinking had taken 3 years. When he stepped on it afterward, there was no knock. The silence surprised him. For a second, he missed the sound. Then he imagined Laurel laughing softly from the doorway, telling him even mercy took its time with him. He stood there with the hammer in one hand and let the quiet be new instead of empty. That evening, he hung his torn jacket on the peg. He had still not mended the cuff. The claw marks remained. 2 faint paw prints marked one sleeve from the day he found it under the junipers. Near the kitchen window, his chipped enamel mug sat beside Claire's turtle pencil sharpener, both catching the last orange light. The ridge settled into summer. The trail reopened in sections, but the old hollow stayed hidden behind brush, stone, and ordinary signs. Hikers passed on the new route without knowing a mother bobcat watched sometimes from a shaded slope, or that 4 kittens had learned the language of dust, grass, danger, and distance just beyond their sight. Elias liked that they did not know. Some stories were not meant to become attractions. Some trust survived only because it was not handled too much. On the last morning of June, the crew found a line of prints after a windy night. 1 adult, 4 small. They crossed the sandy wash, climbed toward the higher junipers, and disappeared where the stone turned hard. Marta stood with her hands on her hips. Family outing. Wade nodded. Supervisor took the interns. Tommy grinned down at the tracks. They're terrible at walking in a line. Elias looked at the prints until the wind began softening their edges. Then he stepped back from them. Good, he said, and he meant all of it. By late summer, the ridge had learned a new kind of quiet. Not the fearful quiet from the day the canyon went still before the coyotes moved close. Not the empty quiet of Junie's enclosure after the bent latch and the twisted blue blanket. This quiet had room inside it. It held insects humming in the dry grass, ravens passing high without hurry, lizards slipping over warm stone, and the faint sound of hikers' boots on the rerouted trail where they could not see the hollow. Elias walked the North Ridge every Thursday morning after the crew reopened the lower sections. He said it was for inspection. Everyone let him say that. He checked drainage cuts, tightened signs, brushed sand from stone steps, and made sure curious feet had not begun making shortcuts toward the hidden slope. He carried his chipped enamel mug in the truck, but not onto the trail. He had learned that some objects belonged to certain seasons of the heart, and the mug had belonged to the bench outside Junie's clinic fence, to the mornings when trust had been measured in 3 feet and 1 dusty paw print. The torn jacket still came with him. He wore it even after Marta threatened to repair the cuff herself. The claw marks remained near the sleeve. The paw prints had faded, but not vanished. When the morning turned cool, he pulled the jacket closed and felt the rough canvas settle over him, like proof that something had happened which did not need improving. One Thursday, Naomi met him at the lower gate with a thermos and 2 quiet nods. "Camera batteries," she said. "Trail inspection," Elias answered. They climbed together without talking much. Naomi had never been afraid of silence, which was one reason Elias trusted her. The air smelled of dust, sun-warmed juniper, and the faint peppery scent of rabbit brush beginning to bloom. Grasshoppers sprang from the trail edge. A raven barked once from a stone outcrop and watched them pass as if judging their paperwork. At the bend above the wash, Elias stopped. The sandy crossing below held prints. 1 adult bobcat, 4 smaller ones, though not as tiny now. The kittens had grown into long-legged, awkward young shadows, still marked with spots, still foolish enough to step on one another's tracks. One had veered toward a beetle trail and returned. Another had leapt from a rock, leaving deeper prints in the sand where it landed with too much confidence. Junie's track stayed steady ahead of them, guiding but not fussing. Naomi crouched and smiled without showing teeth, as if even joy should not startle the ground. "They're moving higher," she said. "Good hunting up there. Good cover, too." Elias looked toward the upper junipers, where the slope folded into broken stone and shadow. He did not feel the old tug to follow. It surprised him how peaceful that was. The part of him that once needed proof had grown tired, or wiser, or simply grateful. He did not need to see Junie every time to believe she was there. A twig snapped above them. Both of them stilled. For a breath there was only light and heat and the dry scrape of leaves. Then Junie appeared on the ledge. She stood partly behind a juniper trunk, tawny coat dappled with shade, amber eyes steady, left ear nicked against the blue sky. Her broken whisker had finally shed or regrown, but Elias still imagined its crooked sternness on her face. She looked stronger than she had in the clinic yard, lean, watchful, complete in herself. Behind her, one young bobcat scrambled onto the ledge, too tall for its own paws, the pale-muzzled one. Elias knew it before he could explain how. It stopped beside Junie, saw the humans below, and froze with exaggerated seriousness. Another shape moved behind them, then another, hidden more by caution than by brush. Junie did not run. She did not approach. She simply looked down at Elias across the distance she had chosen. That was the greeting. That was the goodbye. Elias kept his hands at his sides. His throat tightened, but not with grief this time. Something softer. Something that did not ask to be answered. Naomi lowered her eyes first and took one careful step back. Elias followed. As they turned away, the pale-muzzled youngster pounced clumsily at Junie's tail. Junie turned her head with such exact disapproval that the young one sank flat to the stone, ears wide, all innocence and poor judgment. Elias smiled. Junie led them upward then, away from the trail, away from the hidden hollow, away from every human story that wanted to claim her. One by one, the young bobcats slipped after her into the high junipers, where shade and stone received them without applause. Elias stood until the last branch stopped moving. On the way down, Naomi said, "She trusted you enough to let you see them." Elias considered that. "No," he said after a while, "she trusted the distance." Naomi nodded. "Maybe that's better." At home that evening, Elias sat on the repaired porch step. It no longer knocked beneath him, but he had stopped missing the sound. Claire had written that she would arrive in 2 weeks, and the cabin had taken on a quiet readiness because of it. Fresh sheets waited in the small room. The turtled pencil sharpener still sat by the window. The chipped mug rested beside it, clean and empty. Elias watched the last light leave the sandstone. He thought of Laurel. He thought of Claire coming home for a visit, not forever, and felt no need to turn the visit into anything larger than what it was. He thought of Junie climbing into the high country with 4 young lives behind her. The ridge had not given him back what he had lost. Wild things did not do that. But Junie had shown him that absence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was room for a daughter to return and leave again, room for memory to sit without aching so sharply, room for a wild mother to pass through a man's life, pause once in amber light, and continue on. Elias lifted his torn jacket from the porch rail and folded it across his knees. The claw marks caught the last gold of evening. He ran one thumb over them, gentle as a promise he had finally learned how to keep. The ridge stayed quiet after that, but not forgotten. Wind moved through the junipers in its old dry voice. Dust crossed the trail and softened the prints before morning. The reroute held. The hidden hollow settled deeper into shade, guarded not by fences or signs, but by distance, care, and the kind of respect that made people turn away at the right moment. In Elias's cabin, the chipped mug remained by the window. The repaired porch step held firm beneath every visitor's foot. The torn jacket hung on its peg through autumn, claw marks turned toward the room, as if the cloth itself remembered being useful when fear had been wrapped carefully and carried into sunlight. Sometimes, near dusk, Elias would stop along the ridge road and look toward the high junipers. He rarely saw anything. He did not need to. Somewhere beyond the visible trail, Junie moved through the country that had always belonged to her. Somewhere, 4 young bobcats learned the shape of stone, wind, shadow, hunger, caution, and home. And maybe that was the gentlest ending any wild rescue could have. Not ownership, not a porch pet, not a miracle made loud for strangers. Only a life returned to itself, and a man made softer by having helped it get there. Thank you for staying with Elias, Junie, and the quiet ridge tonight. May your own heart remember the animals that once changed it. May your room feel peaceful now. May the last image be a line of small paw prints, fading into warm dust beneath the junipers, while the evening wind carries everything safely into silence. End of story.